Hello and welcome to Murder Analysed. I'm Christina Moore. Now today's case is the Ronald Jebson case. It's a UK case, again, of a paedophile, a serial killer, a real predator. This man is just awful. So again, out with this video goes out a warning that there is content in this video that talks about the murders of children. It talks about the abuse and rape of children. And again, I always say, if these cases are not for you, you should switch off now. So Jebsen is a classic example, I think, of a paedophile killer. I think this man wouldn't only kill children he knew, because he was so manipulative. He actually killed kids he didn't know. And so these sort of killers are the parents' worst nightmares, I think, when it comes to this, because this man thought nothing of what he did and who he did it to. So this is a really awful case, I think, and it's the first case of Babes in the Woods. Now, Babes in the Wood have two cases, totally separate. This is the 1970 case of Ronald Jebson and the Babes in the Wood murders, plus also then the murder of Rosemary Papper from Hatfield in Hertfordshire. So this is the Hertfordshire Babes in the Wood case. And the reason it's called Babes in the Wood is because the way the children that he murdered were found laying. So that's that case. Don't get it confused, which will come on later on throughout the series of sexual offenders against children. The second Babes in the Wood case is the case in Brighton, and that's in 1986. So this is the first Babes in the Wood case, and this is the Hertfordshire case. So Ronald Jebson was born Ronald Harper in 1938. He was an illegitimate child, and then he was adopted out. So Ron was a little bit of a strange child from very, very young. Didn't have many friends, and he I think he was dyslexic as well. There was a lot going on in this young lad's life. He came from a good home. He'd been adopted, but there was just something about him. He had very few friends, but one of his friends was Robert Papper. Now, Robert, I think, unfortunately for Robert, he befriended this boy from young, so they became friends and he believed him. But this Ronald Jebson is another manipulator, and you'll find this a lot with these serial killers or child killers. They can manipulate. You would think they were your best friends. You trust them with everything, including your children. And the trust was totally broken with this man. So I think by the time Ron was 15, 16, 17. He was already an abuser of children. He was, I think in 1950, he was charged with the abuse of a 4-year-old child. So his abuse started young. He was an abuser from very, very young. I think if you're talking about a clear psychopath, when you look at Ronald Jebson, he clearly is a psychopath. He is someone that you just wouldn't be able to stop. And I have put a slide up, and he's sort of in his words of what he says, which will give you some idea of this man's personality, because he didn't care who the child was. He didn't care if he knew you or not. He didn't care what you'd done for this man. He was going to abuse, rape and murder children. So again, you have someone that now, like 1958, even though he's got now a string of offences against children, and his offences against children were getting more and more serious as the years went on. So by 1958 he'd already been rejected, I think, by the army twice, and in the end he got in. He didn't last very long in the army, but I don't know why some of these people think that being either police officers or in the army would give them some power, but then he did have some basic training now because he had been in the army. So now this made this man, I suppose, more powerful, because that's what he wanted. He wanted this power and control, and I think everyone that he either manipulated or tried to manipulate were easy to manipulate. They befriended him, they believed him, because he's ex-army now, he's come out, and a lot of these people didn't know about these early sexual offences, and if they did, he brushed it off as like they made a mistake, it wasn't them, and they believed him, because these paedophiles, these killers, are so manipulative that they can and will manipulate even sometimes crimes that are so clearly in your face, but they change it around. And I think this is what happened with Robert Papper and others that were related in some way towards these murders with him, that no one really expected him to have done that. So in 1986, Jebsen was jailed for 2 years for the sexual abuse and continual sexual abuse of a 6-year-old girl. Now, he actually told the psychiatrist actually in prison that he was afraid of himself. He knew what he was capable of doing, but by this time, though, he hadn't killed anyone yet. This was just now, and this man is a sadistic man. He's a sadistic killer, a sadistic paedophile, but now he's about to go on, I suppose, to kill. So he was released on the 2nd of March 1970. And, he was in Wandsworth, he was now 31-year-old, and he was out. And it wasn't long before he started to murder. So on the 2nd of March 1970, Jebsen was released from Wandsworth prison. And then he went to stay in like a hostel type thing in Enfield. He couldn't get a job because he'd just come out of prison, and to tell the truth, his criminal record at that time was so bad I don't think anyone would have employed him. So he's on unemployment benefit, and he used to have to go and sign on every couple of weeks to get the unemployment benefit. But he really didn't like living in Enfield. He didn't really know anyone. He was from Hatfield in Hertfordshire, and that's where really he wanted to be. So then he remembers, his friend, Robert Papper, and decides to contact Robert Papper and sort of manipulate him to allowing him then to move in to his property in Hatfield, Hertfordshire, with his wife and his children. And that's what Ronald Jebson did. He was that much of a manipulator that he sort of wormed his way in to this family who felt sorry for him, who believed him. And then I think so he was out on the 2nd of March, and I think it was the 31st of March that Robson had to go to the job centre in Hatfield again, to sign on to get his unemployment benefit. And as he was driving past, he sees Gary and Susan playing, 2 young kids. He stops to talk to them. So these are the children, what they call the babes in the wood. This now is about their murder. So you had Gary and Susan, and I think Susan was 11 and Gary was 12 years old at the time. It was a spring day, March time, a bit windy, but it was a nice day. And these kids then used to like to go out and play football because Gary just loved football. He was football mad, and everywhere he went, he would take this football. And then you had Susan, and she was a little bit of a tomboy, and she loved to play football as well. So really all you could hear all the time was this ball out the front being kicked around and by this pair. So it was about 3-4 o'clock, and Gary's mum shouted out to them, because she could hear him outside, "Don't go far, Gary, because your dinner's nearly ready." And it was one of his favourite dinners he liked. She was cooking that night for him, and so she could still hear the ball being kicked around, and she could still hear them. And all of a sudden, it went quiet. There was no, she noticed, hang on, I can't hear this, the ball being kicked around. So she's gone out to look for him. They wasn't in the street anymore, and she thought, oh, he'll be home in a minute, because he loves this dinner, and it's his favourite, and he'll be back in a minute. So Gary's mum, now a few hours later, is thinking, where's this boy? Where are these children? No one has seen him, heard from him. She's now started looking. Actually, a lot of people were now looking, because these kids seem to just disappear. One minute they were out playing a ball, and whether they was taken from the street, she doesn't know at that time, or whether they'd wandered off and thought we'd just have a kick around somewhere else, is what they did actually. She was frantic, this woman. She knew then, I think, when Gary didn't return home that night, that something had happened to her son. It was on the 17th of June 1970 that a dog walker found their bodies, and they were all huddled together like they were sleeping, and they were covered in this thin blanket, and these twigs and stuff, very makeshift grave sort of thing was covered over them. And I think the way they looked is why they called them babes in the woods, because they looked like they were sleeping. And it wasn't, I think, until the police at first thought they had gone off to play football, wandered into this wood, got lost, and then huddled up together and died of hypothermia. That wasn't the case for these two. So I think it was 11 weeks, and Gary's mum says it was 11 weeks before they've really found their bodies. And the woman never slept. She never went to bed for 11 weeks. She sat up, her and her husband sat up for weeks and weeks and weeks, waiting for these kids to come home, and they didn't. And I think when they was found, there was massive searches and stuff for these kids, but when they was found by this dog walker, it was, for Gary's mum, I think, yes, she now knows, but it broke her heart, and she suffered really with this fault, because the coroner then said, and I think this is what affected her so much, because she knew her son had been murdered, and she knew Susan had been murdered, because when they found these bodies, even though they were sleeping in a position like they'd huddled up together, Susan's underwear, her tights were missing. Now, the coroner at the time, or the pathologist at the time, had said that animals had took her knickers and her tights. And Gary's mum said the only animal that would have ever took a child's knickers and tights is the humankind. And she was so right. So she knew for a long time that these children were murdered. But it took absolutely years, about 30 years, to prove these children were murdered, and they were murdered by Jebsen. So one man, one police officer, one investigator believed as well that these children, that this was not an accident, these kids didn't just lay there and die. He believed, like the mother, that there was no way an animal could do this. Now, his name was Superintendent Leonard Nipper. He is well known for the crays, catching the crays and stuff like that, so he's a well known, but he died actually before this was concluded, this case. But he did look, and he did everything he could to try and find out what happened to these children, but there was just no evidence. You're talking about bodies laying there for 11 weeks, freezing cold, ice is gone. In them days we didn't have the forensic testing like we do now, and so this case could have been a cold case for a lot longer than what it was. And it wasn't until, I think, when Jebsen then was arrested for something else, and we'll go on to that now, is that years later, is that when he then confessed to these murders. And even that, his confession is something, I'll tell you. So I think Superintendent Leonard Nipper, he interviewed about nearly just under 15,000 people, paedophiles, sex offenders within this area, and known people that could have done this, and people that, just random people as well. I think he just tried everything. And Jebsen was one of the people that was interviewed at the time. But as I said to you, he's a very good manipulator. He's very good at what he does. Very good. He is a psychopath. And there was not enough evidence, or no evidence at the time, to incriminate him, to put him forward for this murder. But he was questioned, and he was on the list of the prime suspects for many, many years. So now we've got Jebsen. Now has done these murders on the way back from signing on to get his unemployment benefit, and then he drives back then to Robert Papper's house in Hatfield where he is staying. So 4 days after the murders, Jebsen then, driving around, enticed a young lad into his car. He was an 11-year-old from Nottinghamshire. Now, he was an alcoholic, Jebsen. He also liked to smoke drugs, and what he would try and do is get these kids into this car, give them some marijuana or alcohol, and then to sexually assault them. Now, this boy he didn't murder. He did sexually assault. He had a terrible sexual assault, but he didn't murder this boy. But he was then arrested for that and charged with that. So he was sentenced, I think, to 5 years. Now, don't forget, we've already got now 2 kids murdered that no one knows who's done it. And then you've got Jebsen now, 4 days later, going off and raping, sexually assaulting an 11-year-old boy. And he has also been questioned within this case of these Babes in the Woods case. But I don't think they put the two. I don't think they did put the two together, because again, at the time, you have now Hertfordshire police, you have, London police, the Met police, and now you have Nottingham police, with all these different sort of cases going on. And yes, he did have a history of sexual assault on children, but at that time, no one knew that he had been murdered. And I think this is why he evaded higher sentences and sentences for what he should have been prosecuted for, because, as I keep saying, he's so manipulative and he knew what he was doing. He covered his tracks very well. And for someone, I think, when you're talking about a psychopath, and I've said this before, this mask of sanity is that to the outside world, they look normal. Now, don't forget, he already had a history of being an odd bod anyway. That's what people used to say about him. But just because you're a bit odd or you're a little bit different from the rest of society doesn't make you a murderer. And I don't understand, though, why now these people, like Papper and other families that are coming into it, I can understand why they was manipulated, but I can't understand how he talked himself out of going to prison for 5 years, well, doing 3 years, because as saying, everything in our justice system, they never do their full length term. So then he was out. So you had him then, once he was out of prison, going back to live with Robert Papper again. Now, Robert Papper had his wife and 3 children. Now, the youngest now, Rosemary, was grown up. This is now 3 years on, so she was 8 or 9 years old, I think, at the time. These kids have now grown up. These kids are now more his age. And so are Rosemary's friends. So Rosemary was this pretty girl, blonde, blue-eyed, very blonde, pretty girl, nice girl, good character, strong character, very strong character. She was, a bit of a stunner really, but a very nice kid. And she had a best friend at that time called Michaela Odwell. And Michaela comes into this a little bit later on down the line. But she had a lot of friends, but this was her best friend. Michaela was her best friend. And they then, used to see each other, and the families knew each other. But also, they also then knew Ronald Jebson, because Ronald Jebson had grown up in Hatfield. So I don't know how he evaded about his criminal record, but he did. I think, as far as I'm aware, they didn't know. They may have suspected something, but they didn't know, and I don't think they even knew that he went to prison, because this man was sort of a drifter. He'd come and go, but he was back now in this house with these children. So he'd already now, in 1970, murdered 2, raped and murdered 2. Then he'd sexually assaulted the 11-year-old, but now he's back in Hatfield. Now the next case is the case of Rosemary Papper. So Jebsen now lived in this house. He lived in Robert Papper's house with his wife and his kids, and he used to try and get quite close to these children, buying them sweets, you know, trying to get really close to them. But I think Robert Papper's wife had a feeling, she just didn't, she thought something wasn't right. He was getting too close to these children, and I think she asked him to leave. There was a big row, so something had happened. There was a very big row. She'd asked him to leave, and even the neighbours heard this row, because this man, remember, is such a manipulator. He doesn't like this word no. He's a narcissist. It's all about him. This man has no empathy. He has no care. Everything is about me. So I'm going to live in your house. I'm going to manipulate you. I'm going to rape and abuse your children, because that's what he thinks he can do. But because this woman, Robert Papper's wife, has said, you need to leave, I'm not comfortable, and she wasn't comfortable. I don't think many people were comfortable around him. He absolutely lost it. And even the neighbours have said, he was shouting out, I'll get back at you for this. I'll get you for this. And he did. So on the 9th of June 1974, Ronald Jebson goes to the school of Rosemary Papper and picks her up from school. But unbeknownst to the dad, who's also now gone to pick Rosemary up from the school, finds that she's not there. And he says to the teachers, where's Rosemary? And they say, she's been picked up by Uncle Ron. So at the time, I don't think, even though there'd been this row, and even though the man had left the house, I don't think that Robert Papper thought that he would do anything to that child. I think he thought, well, he's just trying to make friends again. He's probably just going to be at home, you know, pick the kids up for you. But that wasn't the case. And that's not why Jebsen picked up Rosemary from school that day. He picked her up from school. She got in the car. Of course she would. She knows him, even though she was weary of him, because most of these kids were. She'd picked him up. He picked her up from school. She got in the car. And the minute she got in the car and he started to drive, he then starts to tell this girl to drink, to, you know, and I think also threaten her. He's telling her he's going to sexually assault her. But this girl, as young as she was, fought. She fought her for her life. This young child in this car now with this psychopath, sexual predator, sexual killer, is now fighting for her life. And she did fight. But the more she fought, the more she said no, the more the rage he became. He was enraged, and he dragged this girl, took her to the woods, dragged her out, beat her, raped her, strangled her, and then buried her in a shallow grave, the same as he'd done to the babes in the woods, again covering her over. Now, of course he was arrested for this because he'd been to the school to pick her up. But what happened was, before that happened, he was so enraged that this girl didn't play along, because in his sick mind, his sick fantasy is what he wanted to do to this child, and she should have conformed. Rosemary never conformed. Everything this man did to her, he had to fight to do. So good for her for that. She fought until the last minute with this man, but he was so enraged at this. So her death was quite violent, but that wasn't the end of it for Jebsen. He still needed now more, because now he's thinking, I'm going to get Michaela, Odwell, the best friend, because what he says in his statement about Rosemary, about her fighting, and he didn't get this sense of power that he needed to get from her. He didn't get what he wanted. he was so enraged that he thought, right, she's done nothing for me. And these are his words. Nothing. She was just garbage. I just dumped her because I needed then to move on to the next. And he moved on to Michaela, Odwell. So now he's finished now with Rosemary. He's done all that to her, but he's not satisfied. He now can't go back to Robert Papper's house because he's just murdered their daughter, and they know he's took this daughter because the school's told him. And now police and everyone are looking for him and this child. So then he goes to another friend that he knows, the Odwell family. Now Michaela Odwell was Rosemary's best friend. So he goes to the home and he says to the dad, oh, can I stay at yours for tonight? Because don't forget, this man is so manipulative. Don't forget, they don't know any of his background. They don't know now any of his crimes, now that he's a double murderer and an abuser of children. He's now just murdered another child hours before. And when he came in, and so the dad said, yeah, Mr. Odwell said, yes, you can stay, stay the night. But his wife, I don't think, was very happy about that. She was always a bit weary of him anyway. But anyway, they thought it was just one night and it would be okay. But he did have a blood stain on his jumper. And Mr. Odwell, and I think Mrs. Odwell as well, asked about this. And he said, oh, it's my mum, she cut herself and, she's had to soak my jumper, and so it's run a bit to make it look more why he's got so much blood on him, but it's just on the jumper. And I think Michaela Odwell remembers that as well that night with this jumper. That stuck in her mind. And there's reasons why that stuck in her mind, I think. So then what's happened was the next day then, Mr. Odwell has then gone to work, and Mrs. Odwell, of course, is doing her bits and pieces. But that day, Michaela Odwell wasn't feeling well. She hadn't felt well. So the mum kept her off school. So her other sisters and brothers, and that they had gone to school. But Michaela there was then on her own. And I believe that maybe he'd done something, or give Michaela something the night before that made her sick, because to keep her off. Because this man knew what he was going to try and do next. So you've got now Mrs. Odwell in the garden, hanging out her washing, doing a bit of gardening. And then you have Michaela upstairs in bed feeling unwell. And then in comes Ronald Jebson, starts to attack her, starts to strangle her, starts to attack her, telling her if she doesn't shut her mouth, that he's going to do to her what he'd done to Rosemary. And he told her what he'd done to Rosemary. But what happened then was you've got Mrs. Odwell now coming back up the stairs. So he stops. Luckily for Michaela, he stopped. And he put 10p in her hand and he warned her, if you tell anybody about what I've done or what I've said, I'm going to come back and kill you. And it was many, many years later until Michaela Odwell said about what he'd said. She was that much fear of her life with this man, whether he was locked up or not, that she never said anything for years. And it destroyed her life. I think that memory of that destroyed her life. And the Odwells are a lovely, lovely family. So in the interview now, because now he's been arrested, because it's clear that he's going to be arrested, and he was arrested then for the murder of Rosemary Papper. No one knew about Michaela at the time, and no one again also knew about the babes in the wood. So the following day he was arrested for the and he did confess actually. Now Jebsen was such a nasty piece of work that because now he'd killed Robert Papper's child and abused all these other ones, he then never let up. Yes, he admitted to the murder, but then he's tried to then blame about 20 years later, and he kept hinting at this, for I think 1986 he really came out and said that he knew that Robert Papper had murdered Gary and Susan, the babes in the wood. Now he, and I think this then, because the police knew this wasn't right, and they know there was no evidence on that. But then you've got to think, why would he then try and say, and how would he know so much about these murders? Because if it wasn't Mr. Papper, Robert Papper, then it must have been him, because he seemed to know an awful lot about this murder. So they disregarded, they never took any notice of what he said about Mr. Papper. For one, he wasn't even there, he was at work, and it was clearly obvious by now that this man now had done these murders of Gary and Susan, you know, the 11 and 12-year-old in 1970. So it was about 30 years in the end by the time that he actually finally confessed to the murders of Susan and Gary. So them parents, you know, some had died, some were still alive, but at least then they found out, you know, what had happened to them children. But it took 30 years. This was a cold case for 30 years. And it was only due, I think, to Jebsen's want to destroy lives, and he wanted to destroy Robert Papper's life and his family's life, even though taking his child and murdering his child wasn't enough for Jebsen. He was trying everything then to get this man put into prison for something he didn't do, and it was only because of that reason that this murder was really solved. I think Jebsen would have never really have admitted anything unless police had evidence against him, but it was just because his need and want for all them years to incriminate somebody else, harm somebody else, you know, it's shocking really. This man is just shocking. And I've had to leave out a lot of bits in this case because this man is so nasty. He's so evil, I think is the only word for this man. This man could never have been released, never been released. He was definitely the sort of person that would have moved on and moved on. This man wouldn't have stopped. He couldn't have stopped himself. He is a psychopath. And he was born, and I always say this, are they born or made? This man, I think, was born bad and mad. He has got this thing about children, and he wrote once, and I'm not going to say it, I'm going to put a slide up there really about what he said about taking children. He doesn't care about who the families are, or fathers are, or mothers are. He's going to take these children, and he's going to take these children and do things to these children to fulfill his own sexual fantasies, his own empowerment. So you're talking now 30 years on from these murders, and now I'm going to talk about the deaths of Susan and Gary, the babes in the wood. So he talks about, quite openly, because he's reliving it as he's talking about it, about that day. This was an opportunist murder. He was coming home from this job centre where he'd signed on. He'd seen these kids coming out of a football field because that Gary and Susan had left their street and gone over to a local field to start kicking this football around. They were now making their way back so Gary could have his lamb chops, his favourite, you know, for his dinner. And all of a sudden, pulls up next to them is Ronald Jebson and entices them into the car, and he says, get in the car, I'll drive you home. And he's given them some alcohol, and what he says is, this is what he's saying, he's giving them some alcohol, and he's also giving them some marijuana. Take this, you know, you can have it, I won't tell your mum. By this stage now, these kids are a little bit intoxicated, so he's saying, and he takes them then into the woods. Let's go into the woods. As they're in this field and these woods, he's then started to rape Susan in front of Gary. Now Gary, he's saying, is begging, pleading, crying, let us go home. And he's turned around and said to Gary, you're not going anywhere, it's your turn next. So now he is beating, raping, strangling Susan and then he turns his attention to Gary. He starts to punch Gary, hits him, then he rapes him, and then again he strangles him. He places them bodies together. He takes Susan's, I think, bra, knickers and tights with him. He then places them in a position where they're laying flat on their side and cuddling up. Places a little blanket thing over them, tries to hide them then with leaves, and gets in his car and goes back to Robert Papper's house and never says a word. And that was the fate of Gary and Susan, the Babes in the Wood murders. So he had been given a life sentence for the murder, rape and murder and abduction of Rosemary Papper. And then he was given another life sentences for the rape and murder of Susan Blatchford and her friend Gary Hanlon. He was 12 at the time and Susan was 11. So this is the case of the Babes in the Wood, 1970, and the murder of Rosemary Papper, 1974. I hope you found this case interesting. Again, this man, as I say about with these people, how manipulative they are. And I think this case highlights that. It highlights that people, even though they have been charged with certain things, can still hide their true character under this mask of sanity. Now, Ronald Jebson is a psychopath. No help for him. He would never be released. Never. So, thank you for watching. You know what to do. Thumbs up if you liked it. Hitting that thumbs up button down there. You know what to do on this thing with Lacey, where you can subscribe to us. You can also follow us on Facebook and on YouTube. And so thanks for watching. Until the next time. Bye bye.